Hi, it's Katrina. Today we are diving headfirst into the shadowy corners of the past, where whispers of forgotten knowledge and secret societies echo through the ages. We are talking about real-life assassins who trained in the shadows, powerful cults that spanned continents, and other ancient mysteries you won't want to miss. If you're ready, then hit that subscribe button and let's get this historical mystery party started. Assassins of the Ancient World. If you messed around in the Middle Ages with the wrong person, you might get a visit from a silent killer. There was a very real and extremely dangerous order of assassins that lived in castles during the 11th century. In the days of the Crusade, the Nizari Ismaili were trained to kill. Do you know where the word assassin comes from? Researchers believe it came from the term assassination, which used to describe the Nizari Ismaili. They themselves were a small sect of Muslims who broke away from the larger community of Shiite Muslims in the late 11th century. The smaller branch of Islam fled into the mountains of Syria and Iran, where they took sanctuary in castles. Being a religious minority, they had a difficult road ahead of them. They had enemies on all sides, from the Crusaders of Europe to the Turks of the Seljuk Empire. So what do when caught between a rock and a hard place? You learn how to assassinate. For the next 200 years, the small faction of Nizari Ismaili Muslims perfected the art of discreetly removing humans from the living world. They didn't have an army, so they couldn't fight great lords in open battle, but they could send in their assassins to take down important targets and pesky leaders. Let me give you a perfect example of how the Order of Assassins took care of business. One of their enemies was a Crusader leader named Conrad of Montferrat. In April of 1192, Conrad was set to be crowned King of Jerusalem. He went for dinner one night with a bishop in the city of Tyre, a very ancient city, by the way, in modern Lebanon. Dinner went great, and Conrad left without incident. But he never made it home. As he walked towards his house, a shadow moved in his peripheral vision. Before he knew what was happening, the knife had already been plunged inside him. He died at the hands of an invisible assassin. The Nizari Ismaili learned early on that to keep themselves alive, they needed to strike at the top every time. That meant skipping battles and going straight for leaders and generals. Through cunning and stealth, the assassins became legends. Even Marco Polo wrote about them, saying the assassins hand-selected boys to train based on who showed potential with martial arts. The adversaries of the assassins claimed they were fanatical lunatics who gained power by smoking massive amounts of hashish. The truth is a little more complex. Even though people have been writing about them for 1,000 years, nobody knows how the assassins trained. They lived in remote castles across the Middle East, like Alamut Castle in Iran. Whatever regiment helped produce the ninjas of the desert has been lost to history. You most likely want to know what became of the assassins. They met their match when the Mongols showed up at their front door in the 1200s. Of course, it had to be the Mongols. Lewis Haas, a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University, said the Mongols didn't mess around with strategy or maneuvering. They had no interest in covert activities. They were savage and relentless. The Mongols sacked cities, burned down towns, and scorched the earth as they went. Did you know the Mongols collected bags full of severed ears that they cut off their enemies? There would be Mongols wandering around a battlefield with soaking wet sacks of human ears. How do you fight a force that revels in such bloodthirsty barbarism? The Order of Assassins had nobody to assassinate. There was no way for them to infiltrate the Mongol hordes. The Mongols took no prisoners, using terror as a psychological weapon. They took Alamut Castle from the assassins with hardly a fight, and that was the end of the Nizari Ismaili. At least it was the end of their assassin days. The Nizari Ismaili still exist as a religious group across 5 continents and in 30 countries. But as far as anyone knows, they have put away their daggers. The eternal power of the Serpent cult. You might be afraid of snakes, but human beings have been worshipping the serpent since the dawn of time. I'm about to take you into the secret world of the Serpent cult. Let's start in China. The ancient Chinese believed in a terrifying pair of creatures named Fu Xi and Nu Hua. They were giant snakes with the heads of humans. Together, Fu Xi and Nu Hua created the first men and women in the world. They were as if God had mixed up the DNA of Adam and Eve with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. In ancient Sumer, where the Anunnaki gods reigned supreme, it was said Nin Kursag and her husband Enki created the first humans. Enki was known as the Great Serpent. He was the one who gave humans the ability to think and reason, separating us from animals. In Hindu mythology, the dawn of civilization can be traced to the cosmic serpent Ananta. It was through Ananta that the first humans came into existence. I could go on like this all day. There are more origin stories involving a great serpent than you can shake a stick at. Either the serpent was a benevolent being responsible for creating humans, or the serpent was seen as a villain for giving the humans something like free will or secret knowledge. Most of these legends predate Christianity, by the way. I hope you're into mysticism because what I'm about to tell you is very mystical indeed. It has been said that in the days after the great serpents created humans, a cult was created by their earliest descendants. One incarnation of the snake cult was founded in Egypt. It began with Enki, the Anunnaki serpent god of Mesopotamia. He had a son named Ningizida, who was known by everyone from ancient Sumer to Egypt to Tibet. Ningizida was said to have gone to reside in Magan, known today as Egypt. The Egyptians likely worshipped him as Thoth, who was their god of magic and wisdom. In ancient Egyptian myth, Thoth formed a mystery school to promote ideas of enlightenment, philosophy, self-improvement, and cosmic knowledge. Historical records show there was a popular mystery school in Karnak called the Great White Brotherhood. Trust me when I say it isn't as racist as it sounds. This mystery school was an early serpent cult, one that put a focus on expanding your mind. The cult eventually expanded into neighboring Judea, where they became known as the Essenes. If you know the Essenes, I have a hunch your hair just stood on end. They were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Keep watching because the rest of this shocking truth is coming up soon. The time Caesar was kidnapped by pirates. Living in the 1st century BC, crime was rampant. If you think crime is bad today, count yourself lucky you didn't have to deal with pirates 2,000 years ago. Pirates were a huge issue for the Romans. Not even Julius Caesar could escape the wrath of the sea bandits. In 75 BC, Julius Caesar was a young Roman nobleman. He was only 25, not yet the legendary figure he would come to be known as. On his way to study in the city of Rhodes, where the Colossus of Rhodes once stood, he got picked up by Cilician pirates. It was a small inconvenience for Caesar and a nightmare for the pirates. They didn't realize who they had just kidnapped. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents, which was a reasonable price for a noble captive at the time. 1 talent was worth somewhere around $10,000 in modern currency. When the pirates told Caesar how much they were charging for his ransom, he laughed at them. Caesar said 50 talents would be more appropriate. 50 talents would have been $500,000. It was around that time the pirates realized they had made a mistake. Most people they captured didn't suggest increasing the ransom. Then Caesar made himself at home among the pirates, even allegedly bossing them around. Throughout the kidnapping, the pirates held Caesar on a small island. He would write poems in his downtime and recite them to the pirates. He played games with them and often threatened to have them crucified. They thought the crucifixion threat was a joke, but listen for yourself. After 38 days, the massive ransom arrived on the island and they set Julius Caesar free. The pirates thought that was the end of it. They were dead wrong. Julius Caesar raised a naval force in the city of Miletus and went to hunt down the pirates. The pirates hadn't left the island where they had been holding Caesar and were still there with all of his money. Caesar brought them all back as captives. He went down to the prison himself and had each and every pirate crucified. I guess the moral of the story here is don't mess with Caesar. But first, it's shout-out time! I want to give a huge thank you to Sherry with Flowers and Jewels and Ghost Dance for supporting this channel. Thank you so much! We wouldn't be here without you! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. There is a gospel that isn't part of the Bible that sat collecting dust in the archives of a German university library for decades. Only recently was this old piece of papyrus recognized as the earliest surviving copy of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This ancient gospel dates to the 2nd century AD, with its earliest mention being around 180. Even all those years ago, it was considered a heretical text. Irenaeus of Lyon famously called it spurious and apocryphal. Not long into reading the book, you're bound to see why its pages are so rich in heresy. The book paints Jesus as a rambunctious and sometimes malevolent child. A child who committed his first murder at the age of 1. Wait, what? This gospel is all about the baby Jesus as a child. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas gives a detailed account of Jesus Christ's life from the ages of 5 to 12, the 7 years of his life that nobody thought to ask about. In the book, he's presented as a genius child who uses the power of God to perform magic. One chapter says Jesus made some clay birds, then brought them to life. That's kind of cute, no cause for alarm. Not until you get to the next chapter. It says that after a child wasted the water that Jesus had collected, Jesus got mad and cursed the boy. The boy's body then withered into a corpse. That is definitely not in the official Bible. This text claims that Jesus cursed the boy to death, and it wasn't the only time he did it either. There's another chapter in the book in which Jesus killed another child using another curse. This time, the child accidentally bumped into Jesus. It was an honest mistake, but Jesus flipped. He cast a spell of death, and the kid was no more. The community was not very happy about the young Jesus killing the other youngsters. When Joseph and Mary's neighbors complained, Jesus performed a miracle that made them blind. That feels more like a curse than a miracle. Later on, Jesus took back all of the horrible things he did. He started helping people out. He resurrected one of his friends who fell off a roof, and then healed another of his friends who cut his foot with an axe. When his brother got bitten by a snake, Jesus healed him too. The Forbidden Gospel does end on a positive note, but the story as a whole is definitely a little unusual. Even if all this stuff did happen, you can see why the church refused to add this gospel to the Bible and made it blasphemous to read. Hunting for evidence of giants. What constitutes a giant? Was Robert Wadlow a giant when he stood at 8'11" in 1940? Did Robert have the blood of ancient giants like Goliath coursing through his veins? Robert was not a healthy man. He almost stood at 9 feet, but he also died at the age of 22, according to Guinness World Records. He had a growth hormone problem that led to gigantism. At its core, Robert's giant stature was due to elevated levels of a specific growth hormone being produced in his brain. There are several genetic disorders that can make people incredibly tall, like Marfan syndrome, which causes a person's bones to grow longer than normal. But wait a minute, because that's not always the case. Bao Shishun was one of the tallest men who ever lived, standing at 7'9". He didn't have gigantism, nor did he have any genetic disorders. He was a perfectly healthy, real giant. In the 18th century, there were a handful of Irish giants who made money by essentially being circus performers. They were living exhibits who toured around Britain, showing themselves to be real giants. They all stood more than 7 feet tall, with Patrick Cotter becoming the first person in medical history to stand at 8 feet tall. Marta Corbonitz from Queen Mary University of London has done a lot of research into the subject. Marta studied the bones of the Irish giants like Patrick Cotter. She found that they inherited a gene from someone who lived 2,500 years ago. That one gene created a mutation that pushed their heights to the extreme. Could it be the Nephilim gene or the Goliath gene? Is this proof of ancient giants? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Crazy Life of King Caractacus. In the year 43 AD, Rome launched one of the most complex invasions in their history. It's an invasion that very few people know about. Not even those who live in that very land that was invaded 2,000 years ago. I'm talking about the Roman invasion of Britain, one of the biggest historical events to ever take place. At the time, the Hertfordshire area around the River Thames was controlled by the Catuvellauni. They were a mysterious band of warlike pagans. The rulers were a pair of brothers who had divided the kingdom after their father's death. There was Caractacus and his brother Togodumnus. When Romans reached British shores, the brothers launched a series of counterattacks that lasted almost a decade. The Roman invaders were led by Aulus Plautius. He had his work cut out for him. The Catuvellauni were brutal, epic, and fearsome warriors just like the Vikings, who, as we all know, would invade the same shores centuries later. But fearsome fighting wouldn't be enough. Soon Togodumnus lost his life, and the British tribes were pushed to the brink. Caractacus was forced to escape to Wales, so he could regroup and try to launch a counterattack. The Romans were gobbling up territory like hungry hippos. One of the biggest problems for the Catuvellauni was that they were made up of different tribes. The Romans realized this and went about conquering one tribe at a time. This exhausted the Catuvellauni so much that at the Battle of Caractacus in 50 AD, the Romans secured total victory. King Caractacus fled the battlefield, his forces annihilated. He fled far to the north, where he met with the Celtic tribe of the Brigantes. He had a meeting with their ruler, Queen Cartimandua, hoping to secure her help in fighting the Romans. It turned out she had already bowed to the Romans. They had paid her handsomely for her loyalty. Money talks even 2,000 years ago. Queen Cartimandua arrested King Caractacus and sent him to the Romans in chains. Caractacus was transported all the way to Rome, where he was spared by Emperor Claudius, who must have been in a good mood. Caractacus ended up having a pretty interesting life. He went from being a British king to living in exile in Italy. He was the last defiant ruler of an ancient tribe, and he lived out his final days in peace and sunshine in a foreign land. As for the betrayer, Queen Cartimandua, her alliance with Rome secured her queenhood for years to come. In 57 AD, when her consort attempted to seize power from her, the Romans sent a full legion to back the queen in a civil war. Serpent cults revealed. The Essenes were not a serpent cult per se, but likely an offshoot of it. They were the ones behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. They emerged in Judea in the 2nd century BC as a mystical Jewish sect. Although they were Jewish, their system of beliefs was very different. They were hardcore celibate religious fanatics. The Essenes conducted baptisms, were obsessed with purity, and firmly believed in an incoming apocalypse. They thought human history was divided into two eras. They thought themselves to be living in the wicked era, and that after an apocalypse would come the age of perfection. The Essenes also claimed to be in possession of a secret knowledge that nobody else had. Oddly enough, many scholars believe Jesus himself was an Essene, and that Jesus was in possession of this secret knowledge. The forbidden biblical books found in collections like the Dead Sea Scrolls likely mention that very forbidden knowledge. Following everything I've said today about serpent cults, it's safe to say this secret information was passed from Enki to Ninjizida, then to the serpent cult of Karnak, then to the Essenes, and ultimately to Jesus Christ of Nazareth. I don't know what this secret knowledge was, but it's gone now, lost in ancient texts that may never be recovered. Also, you should know this is only one example of the serpent cult. It spread much farther than the Egyptian borders. In Mexico and Peru, you had serpent cults who worshipped gods like Quetzalcoatl and others. In India, there was the Naga king. Vietnam had Po Nagar, their first empress who was also a serpent deity. Even the pre-Christian pagans of the British Isles worshipped serpents. In Burma, it was said the king married a Naga being a sort of serpent mermaid. Even Alexander the Great was connected to a serpent cult. His mother was said to be a cultist who danced with serpents draped around her shoulders. In some artwork, Zeus has been depicted with the tail of a serpent, connecting him to this same cult. What are your thoughts on the ancient serpent cults? Could they be the eternal keepers of secret Anunnaki knowledge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Dark Watchers. Have you ever seen a Dark Watcher? They've been spotted in the Santa Lucia Mountains of California, but nobody knows what they are. Some have blamed the weather, some have blamed paranoia. Others believe the Dark Watchers are supernatural entities living in the mountains. If you've ever lived in California, this is a story that might be familiar to you. A solo hiker's in the mountains as twilight slowly settles over the landscape. In the dim golden light at the end of the day, they see something humanish far ahead of them. It looks like an extremely tall person, only their body is made from pure shadow. It's frightening, so the hiker doesn't know what to do. Maybe they step forward to get a better look, or maybe they turn to flee. Either way, the figure is gone. The mysterious being vanishes like a dissipating fog. The hiker is left with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they just encountered a ghost. This is the experience of meeting a Dark Watcher. It's not a one-off story. Encounters with Dark Watchers are starting to get as common as people spotting Bigfoot. There are dozens of these accounts from people who have visited the Santa Lucia Mountains near Big Sur. All the stories are the same. The twilight figure stands 10 feet tall and always wears a hat. The figure is always carrying a walking stick in one hand. No one has ever been able to interact with a Dark Watcher. Once the hiker realizes they are being observed and they make any movement, the Watcher vanishes. Jason Offutt is an expert on the subject. In fact, Jason is an expert on all things cryptid and creepy. According to him, the Dark Watchers never do anything. They just stand there watching. Then, if the person they are watching tries to approach, they instantly fade out of existence. Some believe the origin of the Dark Watchers can be traced along the oral histories of the indigenous Chumash people. They have been living along the coast of California and on the Channel Islands for the last 13,000 years. It's believed that Chumash lived in fear of the Dark Watchers long before Europeans ever arrived. Then, when Europeans did arrive, they grew to fear them as well. The earliest written account of a run-in with a Dark Watcher is from the 1700s. Spanish colonists were the ones who came up with the name. They called the terrifying entities Los Vigilantes Oscuros. Literally, the Dark Watchers. The sightings have continued ever since, with no one being any closer to an explanation. However, and this is something I'm sure you're going to love, there are similar beings that have been seen in other parts of the world. In Scotland, on the Cairngorms Mountains, people have witnessed something they call the Big Grey Man. It's typically being spotted near the high peak of Ben Macdui. Hikers who have encountered this creature describe it as a giant shadow that follows them. But if they try to get near it, it vanishes, just like the Dark Watchers. What do scientists say? They've blamed both the Dark Watchers and the Big Grey Man on weather phenomena. Meteorologist Jan Newell said the Dark Watchers are likely the shadows of real people. The shadow of a hiker could somehow be distorted in the twilight so it looks like a giant ghost. What are your thoughts? Supernatural entity or trick of the light? The Medici banking empire. Even if you don't know the Medici family or their banking empire, the name more than likely rings a bell. There isn't a family in European history over the past 500 years that has reached the same level of power and influence as the Medici. They even controlled the Vatican at one point. They started in the textile trade but soon upgraded to banking. Giovanni de' Medici opened the first family bank in Florence in 1397. The city became the central hub for the Medici family for the next 400 years. This was the first real banking system Europe had ever seen. There were small banks throughout the Middle Ages, but this was the real deal. They used letters of credit to build an international trading empire. It used to be that if you had gold, it had to be transported by land or sea to be spent. The Medici Bank changed all of that using letters of credit. Somebody could deposit all of their cash at a bank in London and receive a letter. Then they could travel to Italy without having to carry all of their gold. When they got to Italy, they could exchange their letter of credit for the gold they deposited in London. During the Middle Ages, lending money was considered a mortal sin. The church forbade any kind of borrowing or lending. The Medici Bank skirted the religious rules by building interest on all their transactions through their banking system. The Medici family used their wealth and power to reach the highest levels of society. 4 of them became popes and 2 became queens. The Medici family had Pope Leo X, Pope Clement VII, Pope Pius IV, and Pope Leo XI. Then they had Queen Catherine de' Medici and Queen Marie de' Medici. They also provided patronage to some of the most important artists and scientists of the day, like Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, and Michelangelo. But what comes up must come down. As the Medici banking empire grew, they ran into some troubles. There was too much overhead from too many growing branches. Coordination became almost impossible, causing a disconnect between bank branches. Then there was the leadership. After Cosimo de' Medici died in 1464, his sons and grandsons were terrible at the banking business. The Medici family had gotten so drunk on wealth that they forgot what made them wealthy in the first place. By 1494, every branch of the Medici Bank was closed, and the family was on the verge of bankruptcy. The family didn't go away, though. All of the popes I mentioned earlier were installed after the collapse of the banking empire. So were the queens. The family had gotten so rich that they were firmly embedded in politics. All they had needed was a little money to get started. The Werewolf of Ansbach. In 1685, a beast stalked the countryside in the German state of Bavaria. Locals in the Principality of Ansbach reported a monstrous wolf eating their livestock and occasionally devouring their children. What started as whispers of an animal became a legend that has still never been explained. Do you believe in the supernatural? The people of Ansbach certainly did. Just before the attacks began, they had been miserable under the tyrannical rule of Michael Leicht. He was sort of like a local governor who had run the town into the ground and just been all around terrible. He was the worst, and then he was dead. And then came the wolf attacks. The townsfolk started speculating that Michael hadn't truly died. Instead, he had transferred his spirit into the form of a wolf. He couldn't continue being the ruler of the principality, but rather than fade into the afterlife, he morphed into a beast to terrorize his subjects by eating their children. Talk about pure evil. Just go to the afterlife already. Why terrorize everyone? The attacks became so vicious that the townsfolk banded together to hunt the beast. They prepared what's known as a wolf pit. They dug a huge hole, filled it with spikes, and then threw a rooster inside. Then they covered the entrance with loose branches and straw. When the wolf fell into the pit, it was killed. The hunting and trapping weren't entirely eventful. What happened next was, the townsfolk, still believing the beastly wolf contained the malevolent spirit of Michael Leicht, paraded its corpse through the streets. Then they cut off its head and replaced it with a fake head. That fake head had the features of Michael Leicht. The townsfolk even put a wig on it. Then they hung the wolf from a gibbet so that everybody could see. What are your thoughts on this bizarre episode of medieval history? Were the townsfolk crazy, or was the wolf really evil incarnate? The powerful goddesses of ancient Egypt. You won't find more fantastic goddesses than in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Every ancient civilization had their own goddesses, but Egypt was something special. Let's start with Bastet, the feline goddess depicted as a woman with the head of a cat. She was the goddess of fertility, music, and dance. Her cult center was the city of Bubastis. Her worshippers held elaborate festivals to celebrate the goddess with music, dance, and delicious feasting. She was one of the more entertaining and fun goddesses. Hathor was one of the earliest deities in Egyptian history. She was the divine goddess of motherhood, daughter of Ra. As the daughter of Ra, the almighty god of the sun, Hathor wore a solar disk upon her head, cradled inside a pair of bull horns. Her sigil looks kind of like a halo in the middle of devil horns. Then the goddesses start to get a little strange. For example, Heket. She was depicted as a beautiful woman with the head of a frog. Her froggy form was to represent the annual flooding of the Nile. It was believed that Heket helped protect mothers when they went into labor. She had temples built in her honor, and new mothers would wear amulets dedicated to Heket. Isis is likely the most well-known of the Egyptian goddesses these days. She was the goddess of women and royal power, but she was also the goddess of magic and healing. Isis was sister and wife to Osiris, lord of the underworld. It was Isis who brought Osiris back to life after he was murdered by their brother Seth. The Egyptians even had their own goddess of war, Neith. She may have been the oldest of all the goddesses, worshipped during the pre-dynastic period before Egypt was technically Egypt. Neith began as the creator of the entire universe, a job that can't really be topped. Her name translates to, "She is the terrifying one." Then, over the centuries, Neith was demoted from creator of the universe to goddess of warfare and hunting. There was Nekbet, the goddess of protection, depicted as a vulture, and there was Nut, goddess of the sky. Sekhmet was the lioness goddess of destruction. Serket was a scorpion goddess whose primary duty was to protect against venom. There was also Wadjet, the cobra goddess, and Taweret, the hippo goddess. And let's not forget Seshat, who was the goddess of wisdom, patron deity of architects and scribes. She was involved in recording histories and overseeing the construction of temples. They called her the Lady of the Library. Her symbol was a 7-pointed leaf that looks suspiciously like a leaf from a marijuana plant. Which goddess is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching!
Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Giant of Odessos. The skeleton of a very large individual was discovered during an excavation in Bulgaria. It happened in March of 2015 in the city of Varna, with archaeologists from the local Museum of Archaeology taking the lead on the investigation. They uncovered the bones of a truly giant person underneath the fortress wall within the ruins of the old city of Odessos. According to the initial reports coming out of Europe, scientists were shocked at how big the bones were. They quickly concluded the individual lived around the 4th century AD, and that the skeleton belonged to a man. Professor Valery Yotov, the man in charge of the team, described the bones as impressive, although he refused to give the exact height of the skeleton. He simply said the man was very tall. But the mystery doesn't stop there. No one knows where the skeleton came from in the first place. The bones were discovered underneath the wall, meaning they must have been placed there before the wall was put up. Professor Yotov suggested the person may have died while working on the fortress, then was buried in its foundation. But it's weird because there haven't been any other skeletons found here. Some have suggested the prehistoric man may be much older than the ruins under which he was found. Some even say he could belong to an extinct race of giants, believed to have roamed Europe thousands of years ago. Gigantopithecus Bigfoot. From roughly 2 million years ago until 100,000 years ago, there was a very real giant that roamed the planet. It was the biggest ape that ever lived, a shockingly huge beast known as Gigantopithecus blackeye. This monumental ape was identified and named by anthropologist Ralph von Koenigswald after its discovery in 1935. This prehistoric creature truly was a giant, with an outward appearance much like a gorilla. Only this thing weighed upwards of 660 pounds and stood around 12 feet tall. To put some perspective on that, the Gigantopithecus was about 40% heavier than the average modern gorilla. So, what does this have to do with giants? There is a theory which claims the Gigantopithecus is the ancestor of Bigfoot, and that Bigfoot is a missing link between humans and great apes. In other words, Bigfoot is maybe a hybrid between apes and people, making it a living giant. We already know the Gigantopithecus is related to modern orangutans. Scientists connected the two animals by testing a 1.2 million-year-old molar found in China. Trying to connect the ancient ape with Bigfoot will be a little more difficult, considering Bigfoot has never even been properly photographed, never mind tested for DNA. But if the theories are true, it would mean giant ape-like humans are still alive right now, hiding somewhere in the North American wilderness. What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below. Giants in the Ozarks. There are a lot of myths and legends in America's Ozarks. Tales of gold, lost treasure, and biblical giants are among the most common. In the late 19th century, stories began circulating of abnormally large skeletons being found in burial mounds throughout the Ozarks. These skeletons supposedly belong to prehistoric people far taller than ordinary men and women today. Other more fringe theory promoters believe their denial isn't coming from a place of scientific knowledge, but from stubborn unacceptance of anything that goes against the grain. One of the greatest giant discoveries in the Ozarks history came in April of 1934. A landowner named J.D. Crane discovered a symmetrical mound on his property. Atop the mound was a cluster of white oak trees, and it looked as if they had been there for a very long time. In fact, the mound didn't appear out of the ordinary at all. It was just a lump of earth with some trees growing on it. But what J.D. found underneath would shock the nation. According to historical records, he discovered 7 skeletons, and at least one was over 8 feet tall. Along with the bones, he allegedly discovered petrified human hearts. This happened almost a century ago, and we still don't know the truth. The story was relayed in the Springfield Daily News, the article published on April 25, 1934. We know this happened, but we don't really know the true details since newspapers were kind of sensationalized back then. Scientists dismissed the discovery as nonsense, and no one even knows where the skeletons are anymore. Giants of Gath. Archaeologists were excavating areas in the Philistine city of Gath when they came across ruins made from huge pieces of stone, dating back to the 11th century BC. They found a city built for giants, with disproportionate architecture and supersized fortifications. The reason this is so important is that the 11th century was when the story of David and Goliath in the Bible took place. That was about 3,000 years ago. Putting aside any religious doubts, most scholars do agree that David was a living historical figure. He lived when Gath was a thriving Philistine metropolis. There is also a good chance that he did in fact fight single combat with someone named Goliath. In the Bible, Goliath comes from the city of Gath, the city just found to be composed of gigantic buildings fit for real giants. A lot of things in the Bible really did happen. For example, Gath was destroyed around the year 830 BC, just like what's written in Kings 2. Bar Ilan University professor Aaron Mayer says the architecture in Gath was found to be larger than anything else in the Levant during the same era. The walls were wider, the fortifications were bigger, the material used to build the city was different. All evidence points to a city of giants, which corroborates the biblical narrative about Goliath. It looks like there really may have been a group of gigantic people here in biblical times. People who had to build bigger houses with stronger walls. Big shout out to Quell Bies and Amanda Fahey. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos about amazing history. The Kinametsin Giants. In Aztec mythology, the Kinametsin was a race of giants who lived on the earth in the days before modern humans. Aztec legend states that there were 4 old cycles of creation and destruction before the one we are currently in. The world was full of creatures and people, and then the world was destroyed, and then a new cycle began fresh. This happened over and over, similar to what we see in the Bible. The previous era was when the Kinametsin ruled the globe. However, they refused to honor the gods, and so their mighty civilization had to come to an end. The Aztec gods brought calamities down on the giants, wiping out most of their people and bringing an end to the era. This is oddly similar to the story of the Nephilim in the Bible, who turned against God and then were washed from the earth, beginning a new cycle for humanity. But what kind of proof is there that giants truly lived in Mexico and the surrounding area prior to the Aztec? The Aztec attributed many things to the old race of giants. They believed the monumental pyramid of Cholula was built by the giants. This shouldn't be a big surprise considering the Mexican pyramid is the largest in the entire world by volume, 25 meters tall and 300 by 315 meters wide at its base. The Aztec also believed the Kinametsin were behind the creation of Teotihuacan. Ecuadorian giants. Impossibly gigantic skeletons were uncovered in the Amazon region of Ecuador. According to a research team led by anthropologist Russell Dement, the bones were recovered starting in 2013 and then sent to Germany for examination. The team supposedly found over a dozen human skeletons from the 1400s, only about 600 years old. Yet these skeletons all measured between 7 and 8 feet tall. When asked about the discovery, Russell told reporters he didn't want to make any large claims or speculation because the work is still ongoing. But he did admit the discovery has some interesting implications. These skeletons appear to be the remains of giants. These were not just the abnormally large bones of prehistoric men, but included female remains as well. In most cases of giant skeletons found in the ancient world, it was a man who somehow grew to be an extra foot tall. But these skeletons indicate an entire race of giants, all of whom were 2 and 3 feet taller than ordinary. Unfortunately, nobody knows what became of this unusual archaeological find. Russell did mention that he was concerned about looking harebrained, understanding the discovery of giants was unconventional and controversial. But it's been almost a decade, and we still don't have official scientific confirmation. So, as far as we know, these skeletons were dug out of burials in Ecuador, identified as giants, sent to a laboratory in Germany, and the case was closed and buried. The Cahokia giants. Astoundingly large human skeletons were found buried in mounds in early 19th century America. It was right around the turn of the century that hundreds of reports started flooding the nation's newspapers from reliable sources. Each one claiming giant skeletons were starting to be uncovered in different places in America. Most of the giant skeletons were being found in burial mounds. These mounds are all over the U.S., but primarily in the southeast. Some of the biggest we know about include the Cahokia Mound, built long before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. The Cahokia Mound is about 100 feet tall, and its base is about 14 acres. It was from burial mounds like this, created centuries ago by a lost people, that the giants were uncovered. All the way from Massachusetts to Arkansas, mounds were dug up, and skeletons of humans up to 10 feet tall were uncovered. Men, women, and their children even. Some of these people had legs that were 5 feet long, the average size of many humans on Earth. It may sound like 19th century paranoia and hysteria, but there are real newspaper articles from reputable sources like the New York Times. However, the reports didn't last long. Almost as quickly as the giants started being found, stories of them stopped being published, and all the skeletons supposedly vanished. There isn't a single one left today to prove giants once lived in America. The Giant of Egypt. Sa-Nakht was the giant who ruled over ancient Egypt 1,000 years before Ramses II took the throne. He has been a mysterious figure ever since archaeologists learned his name. We don't know exactly when he took charge of Egypt, only that it was around 5,000 years ago. We also don't have any written records on what type of king he was. We know only of his existence because of seal fragments discovered at Abydos in Egypt. In 1901, Sa-Nakht's remains were allegedly discovered in the small village of Beit Khalaf, but it's not entirely certain. Somebody's bones were found here during excavations, and there were some fragments bearing the name of Sa-Nakht. However, the tomb was never officially labeled his, and may have belonged to a high official or even a queen. Discovered in the tomb was the skeleton of a man of great height. He would have stood 6 feet 1.5 inches tall, way taller than any other living Egyptian. Famous physician Charles S. Myers said the average ancient Egyptian only stood at 5'6", meaning the skeleton belonged to a real giant. It may have been the pharaoh, potentially the tallest pharaoh to ever rule Egypt. He may even have been a descendant of a race of giants, going deeper into prehistory. Giant hand axes. The mysterious tools of giants have been discovered in Spain. Giant hand axes that were used between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago were recently analyzed by a lab to see what their function was. Scientists determined the enormous tools were used to process things like wood and animal carcasses. They were used by our own mysterious ancestors to process food in prehistoric Europe. The hand axes are positively massive. The ones found in Spain are roughly double the size of most other similar tools used by modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. For a person to have used the tool, they would have needed both hands, and it would have been extremely awkward. It honestly makes a lot more sense that the tool was used by a mysterious race that was significantly bigger than we are today. And while that would be the thing that makes sense, scientists have denied the possibility. Researchers say that even though the hand axes were so big, almost comical, the human species which used them was likely of average size. Scientists called them archaic Homo sapiens, meaning they were close to modern humans, but not quite there yet. The Longshan giant. In 2006, researchers discovered a human skeleton of unimaginable proportions. It was found while Chinese archaeologists were excavating a prehistoric site in Shanxi province. The skeleton was dated back to the Longshan culture of between 4,400 and 4,000 years ago. Based on the features of the skeleton, archaeologists were able to determine he was a young man, between 16 and 18 years old. The weird part was that his skeleton was measured at 6 feet 3 inches. This made him significantly taller than any other skeleton found in the region. According to an article published by the Cambridge University Press, The Longshan skeleton proved to be the tallest ever found in prehistoric China. The remains were nicknamed the Longshan Giant. We don't know where this giant came from, if there were more like him, or if he was a biological fluke. Researchers believe he belonged to an entirely different race of giants, one that shared several characteristics with people from modern southern Asia. But his race was likely older, maybe a fringe group of humans that grew to gigantic proportions. Even more outrageous is that archaeologists found 3 holes drilled in the right parietal bone of his skull, just like a bowling ball. But nobody has ever figured out why. Everything about the Longshan giant is a mystery. Thanks for watching! Do you think giants really walked among us? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon. Bye!